I'm here to share a perspective today on organizational maturity specific to OT cybersecurity. Now, you're probably wondering, what exactly does that mean? Well, it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, but most importantly to the leaders, they can answer a couple different things. One, what happens when there's a cyber breach? Not if, but when. What are the true impacts and risks to the organization? Who's fixing what? And most importantly, where's the return on the invested products and security services that were just deployed? Several things that the pandemic taught us was that expect the unexpected, and that change could happen very rapidly. It thrusted digital transformation into our OT environments like never before, regardless of your belief system around the word digital transformation. Workforces were thrusted into a remote situation, all the while businesses still having to deliver their product and services. And just like that, change happened rapidly. Evolving threats, as you're here today listening to them unfold, happen and are actually becoming more real than they ever have. Is it because of the political instability? Probably so. And we're faced with having to evolve and change and respond in a rapid manner. All of this is creating instability across the world, and this instability is creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And because our world is changing so rapidly, our mindset must change as well. Now, I know you're probably looking at this picture here, and for some it might be familiar. For some it might be funny, and some might be, wow, I recognize this guy. He's our friendly IT guy that's now on the shop floor. Maybe it's the new CIO with no OT experience. Maybe it's the governance assurance teams asking questions of our OT operators and engineers on what do they have here? What are the risks and what's important in this environment? For some, these individuals give you pause as an OT practitioner. Why? Because they're not OT, they don't understand non-productive time, loss of life, health and safety hazards. Perhaps we can train them and change our mindset to rely on them, because in the end, it really does take a village to combine business, IT, and OT together to answer those fundamental questions on where is our risk and what is our impact. But most importantly, a mindset change so that we can create a sustainable maturity in our organization. So I'll give you a quick, brief history lesson here on resiliency and how change made an impact. It's World War II, London's under attack by German air raids. Government thought for sure London was over and to expect the worst. You want to know what their incident response plan was? To expect more daily air raids, to expect hundreds of thousands of deaths, to expect the hospitals to be overworked and just crumble. And sure enough, chaos would then ensue. But what really happened? Well, leadership stepped up, and Winston Churchill instituted a memo each day called Activate Memo Daily. And he asked and called upon all leaders to do one impactful thing each day. He also asked and demanded that we all work together as they were underground, having no choice and left to learn and lean on each other. He reminded everybody to smile and to realize this was a process, but most importantly, to have a moral purpose to survive. London's World War II and the aftermath is our critical infrastructure today. While they stayed up night wondering if bombs were hitting their homes, their businesses, and perhaps result in death, that's us at night as OT practitioners wondering when the next cyber threat's going to impact our environment and how will we respond. But I rest easy because as London demonstrated the will to preserve and survive, so too will our industry of OT practitioners have and demonstrate a resolve to mature. That is why we're all here today, isn't it? To learn, to mature. So what's holding us back? Well, regardless if you're an organization that may have a federated, decentralized management model, meaning you at the business level, at the operations level, own your budget, own your SMEs, are responsible for your output. Perhaps you have limited resources, not enough SMEs with OT experience to understand and translate cyber. We've seen an influx of non-technical, non-OT cyber professionals enter this realm. Maybe it's all the processes or the lack of, all the regulator requirements, you're dealing with customer requirements, board of directors asking a lot of questions, and maybe you have too much technology that you don't know how to translate and make sense of it. Or maybe you're the opposite, and your organization is leading the evolution in a shared service model, where they recognize that no longer at the operations level is it just their responsibility to secure their own environments. Perhaps it's a shared model where organizations at the top, leadership at the top, create resources. It just may not be in the shape or the form that we expect and want them to. It's going to be a collective unit of individuals that are all after the same goal, and that is to secure critical infrastructure. And perhaps they're coming with their latest pen and paper, with the latest framework, asking 100 questions. But those questions will help identify where the risks are, what's in place, and what's not. And then hopefully that technology that's in place can be translated and communicated up to the board level on what the technical risk is. So, how did we get here, and where did the market influence us along the way? Well, I have to go back to the early 2000s when we saw an influx of IP-based asset equipment make its way and entrance into our PCN, SCADA, critical infrastructure environments. I'm talking about the IP drilling chairs on your high-spec drilling rigs. I'm talking about the dynamic positioning and wastewater management systems that are all translating data back on shore. I'm talking about those IP digitized cranes that are installed at the latest terminal in ports. All of that digital data made way for the Guardian solutions that entered into the market. And for once in a long time, we had visibility on what actually existed. And then it created a visibility around the vulnerabilities at the node and IP level. And for our OT practitioners that were installing it and thought this was the best day ever, they soon realized that they didn't really understand the full breadth of the cybersecurity posture for which this information was now telling us. How were those OT professionals to translate the actual technical risk on up to dollars that the company just invested? That made way for the service industry boom so that industrial critical infrastructure focused organizations could come in and make sense and translate this information. So what's next for the industry? How do they get that information at the technical level up to the boardroom so that it creates a holistic view of technical risk and business risk? Well, it starts with assessments. Now, I know what you're thinking. Assessments is a bad, dirty word. But the truth about it is that everybody is doing them. And specific, the asset owners. The asset owners are doing assessments each and every day, whether it's through the IT department, the business departments, or on the OT floor. And they're doing it for a couple of reasons. They have to communicate up on the current state of their union and demonstrate a path forward to maturity. And most importantly, it gives them a roadmap of their buying habits, of what to buy next. And if they don't have resources internally, they're going to lean on our consultant friends, our organizations, our vendors that have the expertise on hand that can come in and showcase a demonstrated methodology and progression to a successful, maturing organization for cybersecurity. But what you don't realize is that they're starting with assessments and ending with assessments. And so too are the OT-focused products. Even though they claim that they're not doing assessments, they start with an assessment. Why? Because the leader wants to know where the return on investment is. If your current state without their solution is X today, where is the current state with their solution tomorrow? It starts and ends with an assessment. So if we're going to do assessments, we should do them right. And at the end of the day, we are all just spokes on a wheel, supporting our asset owners to a level of maturity and desired state for cybersecurity. Because whoever owns the assessment is the gatekeeper for purchasing power, the gatekeeper for maturity of cybersecurity. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's still probably some naysayers around assessments, because those are viewed, and an internal belief system is that they are a snapshot in time, that they're not dynamic enough. But innovation can prove otherwise on that topic. But let's just say, okay, we're not going to invest in assessments, and we're going to lean on the Guardian solutions and the technical equipment that we've installed. How's that working for you in terms of bridging the gap of your technical insights into the impacts and the risks for the business? Perhaps you've, through acquisition, have ended up with multiple solutions that are outputting technical risk, not only in CVS scores, but CVSS, VPRs. They all have their own threat algorithms that decipher what the true threat is based on the vulnerabilities at the node points. How are you bringing that together and communicating the true risk? It's probably pretty challenging. I know from the field it is. So perhaps you bring in your consulting groups that can bridge that gap. But really, is it their responsibility to bridge that gap, or is it the challenge of the asset owners to improve internally and bring in additional information? So if you're going to do assessments, you should do them right. Now, I know you're probably thinking, wow, where do I start? I have every regulation recommending a certain standard, a guidance, and I also have my clients pushing down our throats their own internal requirements. Where do I start? It can be extremely overwhelming, especially if you have limited staff and your day job is to keep product moving and prevent loss of life and prevent health and safety risks. You don't have time for this. And so perhaps there are some resources that are tasked to do this. Again, remember, it takes a village. It's not just the OT practitioner's responsibility to do this. So with all these frameworks, with all these recommendations, where do you start? Where do you pick? Whatever you pick, wherever you start, you should be aiming to answer a couple simple things. What's my recovery time? What is the true impact? What standard is going to allow me to move from point A to B on my maturity? What threats is this really going to disclose? These are a lot of great questions that these frameworks should do, but most importantly, the framework is supposed to create a common syntax language that the organization can get around so that they can track progression. So in order to do that effectively, it takes a village, IT, OT, and the business working together in a certain layer of capacity. And to do that, there are different assessment models that lend to that visibility, to that holistic approach to risk and identifying impacts. Well, starting with business impact analysis, at the highest, most level, it's going to disclose what are the financial impacts, the risks, as well as help you prioritize what assets to even begin your journey on maturing your cybersecurity for. And then you have your gap assessments, also known as framework-based. Those are going to allow you to create a baseline after you've scoped out which assets are important to the business and align against a certain set of frameworks, requirements, and controls and help you communicate effectively across business lines. And we usually see this around IT governance teams really getting engaged and involved at the OT level with this type of approach. Business impact, we typically see more on the business side. It can come out of the finance department. It can come out of the marketing department, whichever department is really responsible and having resources for that. And then lastly, it's the component assessment, also known as equipment. We typically see this in the field and at the OT level. Why? Because these types of assessments are down to the equipment level, the sub-function, and having a really depth-of-breadth understanding of the real threat scenarios as it relates to the hazards, the safety risks, as well as the mitigating controls. It takes a layer of expertise to dive into that. So where do we start again? Diving into the BIA, business impact analysis. You're that CISO, you're that leader that has come in and have been asked by the president, what assets, if impacted, would produce non-productive time, loss of revenue, loss of life? And you probably don't know where to start. The business impact is really going to give you good visibility into what assets those actually pertain to. Think of the latest breach that happened last year. All of a sudden, boards were asking, are we subjected to ransomware? And if so, what dependencies exist in our environments? Business impacts analysis started becoming extremely popular in the past couple years to answer those questions. Besides, it produces some pretty good visuals, red, green, yellow, and what executive doesn't love and understand red, green, yellow? So some of the pros around that is it really bridges the gap between the business side and operations, and it starts that layer of communication to understanding what's important, because not all assets are created the same. Some of the challenges with the BIA really resolve around the scenarios that are used in the likelihood of an actual incident. And it is pretty subjective based on who's doing them. And it does take some time to understand of all assets where to really begin and execute on a BIA. And so we typically see this on the lower scale of maturity of organizations. And when I mention a maturity, it's not based on their revenue. It's really around the resources and the activities that they're doing to move the needle of cybersecurity holistically throughout the organization. By the time we get to framework assessments, this is really the industry's sweet spot right now. This is really where an organization is aligning to a given standard or framework around a standard taxonomy language of controls. These controls are typically mapped to requirements, oftentimes NIST-based, ISO, IEC. And some of the challenges around implementing framework assessments is that depending if you're a global organization, you probably have mandates that transcend US requirements. You have requirements that transcend your client's assets and requirements. And how do you bring it all together? What starts with centralizing and picking a single framework to bridge that taxonomy gap. And so once that's done, you can start to align your teams between business and IT and OT together around a common language. And this allows you to communicate upward and downward to your operations teams effectively. The time allocation is somewhat high because, as you know and are familiar with some of these frameworks, they can be several hundred requirements just in one. And it takes a lot of herding of the cats to get everybody in a room and answer these questions. And then what do you do with these requirements? Well, you can identify the missing gaps, you can map threats, you can map risks, and this starts to paint a holistic picture around your risk posture when it comes to people, process, and technology. And we haven't forgotten about those technologies that are plugged in and giving us insights. When it comes to a more mature ARC organization, we start to see component assessments, equipment layer assessments. Again, I would say this is fewer than 1% of organizations out there doing this today. And so the reason why there's so few organizations doing component level equipment is the expertise that it takes to do this. It usually takes an OT cybersecurity expert to really understand the network topology of a given control environment. It takes an expert to understand what controls should be in place, what mitigating controls are already mapped, and oh, by the way, have a data repository of all equipment and understand what specific threat scenarios, maybe 4 cases that are really relevant to that environment, and then start going through a series of scenarios to really truly identify the risks to that equipment or sub-function level in a control environment. This, again, is on the maturity arc of organizations, and it's not very common, but those are the innovative organizations leading the way today. So when I go back to organizational maturity, we really see the industry evolving into 4 distinct phases. You are either in a prepare, a baseline, an accelerate, or incorporate phase, and I'm going to dive into each of those here shortly. But at its core, if you're in the prepare phase, it has nothing to do with the revenue of your organization. It really comes down to where you are from a cybersecurity program within the organizations and the resources that are allocated to it. You're typically planning your journey. By the time you've gotten to the baseline, you've solidified a framework that you want to try to create a common language taxonomy around. You're aligning stakeholders, and you're establishing a plan of action. When you've transitioned to accelerate and incorporate, you've been doing your program for a couple years, and you've worked out the bugs, you know what resources are needed, and you're ready for repeatable task and automation. And by the time you get to incorporate, you've installed so many technological solutions, you've incorporated the BIAs, and you're doing framework assessments, and you're ready for a holistic breadth of information to sum up and answer those 4 questions in the beginning. So perhaps this profile might fit you, those that are in the room that are new to OT, that are a CISO, that are a CIO with no OT background. There is no cybersecurity program in place because it didn't exist before then, but you've been brought in to figure it out. Your first year will be spent trying to understand the business, the enterprise risk strategy, trying to figure out what kind of budget would even be necessary to even start your program, and most importantly, getting buy-in from your business units, your operating executives, your engineers, really trying to rally them around creating this program. And most likely you're going to start with a BIA because you don't even know what you have. So the BIA is going to tell you what assets are most important to the organization, and then those would be effectively your scope of assets that transitions you into the baseline section. By the time you've gotten to baseline, again, you've probably picked out a framework. Maybe it's multiple frameworks because you're global organizations with assets all over the world, and you need to follow some rules that are subjected to the UK or APAC region, and then you're figuring out how to control and commingle all that information. But the most important part of being in the baseline is that you're doing assessments and you're figuring out what exists. You're identifying controls that are specific to your environment that are either there or non-existent. You're perhaps sharing some of those insights across the business unit because you need support. Support to implement tools, support to train individuals because perhaps that's a challenge and a gap. But most importantly, you're building your ecosystem of knowledge and awareness. By the time you're at Accelerate, this program's probably been in place, as I mentioned, 5 to 8 years. Anything below that, you're still in baseline. And that is really, truly what we're seeing from the field. Those that are in Accelerate phase are ready for automation. They've been doing the assessments, they know what's missing, but the reality is you're not gonna get hundreds of millions of dollars for your budget each year. You're gonna have to slice it up. So that's why organizations stay multiple years in that baselining phase, because you just can't assess everything in 1 year. You just don't have the resources. So it takes several years to get to Accelerate, where you finally have assessed everything and now you know what is missing and what kind of budget you need to deploy to affect change. In Accelerate, you're also perhaps working with your supply chain to really understand and mandate requirements to them, because now you understand what you have in your environment. Now you know what's necessary, and if you're going to continue to do business, you might as well partner and make sure that they're deploying secure assets as well. So right now, you're collaborating with business units, and you're probably communicating to the board. So now this is getting tracked at a quarterly basis. So once you start, you can't stop. Kind of like getting on that hamster wheel when you're fundraising for your company. Can't really stop. When you get to Incorporate, again, I mentioned you have a lot of solutions in place. You have integrated insights that you want to commingle with framework assessment outputs. And perhaps you're also pushing down your assessment programs downstream in a decentralized manner because of automation capabilities. You're standing up validation protocols, and you're incorporating additional specific business contexts into the assessment layer. So putting all three of these things together, what this really enables you as leaders is to answer those questions. What happens when we get breached? What is impacted? That's your BIA. Where is our real risk and what are we doing to fix it? Those are your framework and gap assessments. And what is the true threats that are facing our organization today? That comes down to the equipment subcomponent level understanding. And when you have all of that, your organization is maturing at a rate that is sustainable. And then of course, things are gonna change. But just like things can change rapidly for one country, so can for this industry. In London's darkest days, they thought it was over, but they persevered. They did impactful things each day as leaders. You don't need the government to tell you what to do or to wait for a framework to come out or a client to send you a list of requirements. You action every day. It's the culture that you manifest within your organization to do something about it. You have intense teamwork and rally together like they did. And have some fun along the way. I mean, we're all here in Miami enjoying this weather, aren't we? And so lastly, they had a moral purpose to survive. And just like that, they are a shining example of what can be when working together comes together. Thank you.